Welcome to another episode of Treasure Corals. As you know, I have multiple aquarium systems, and while I primarily use Ecotech and aqua elimination products when it comes to lighting and water flow, as well as dosing, when it comes to controlling and monitoring things, I rely on my Apex. I bought my first Apex controller over 12 years ago, and it's still being used on my quarantine system. It's the Apex Classic. And after running this channel for many years, one of very frequent questions that I get asked is how do I configure my controllers? All of my systems are being run quite similarly. So we'll use one of them as an example, and in today's video I will show you exactly how I configure and run my aquariums. So let's dive right in. For Apex, I use Apex Fusion on my mobile device. In this particular case, I have my iPhone, and we can see that all of my aquariums, so there's 3 systems, I can see them at a glance. However, when I need to program things, or maybe I need a little bit more space to see things or move around between them, I rely on the website. So I use them interchangeably. What I also like about Apex Fusion is the fact that if you have multiple mobile devices, so say you have the very old iPhone that instead of throwing out, you can actually run Apex Fusion on it. You can put it on some sort of a mount, always on display, and now you have that beautiful display monitor. So I have a couple of those around, and what I really like about that is that they don't get confused. So if you control something on your phone, it will usually get updated, or at least it won't get confused on another device. And I also like the fact that I can see things in color, I can see in large letters the most important parameters. So overall, it's very well designed software in my opinion. And lately, with the advent of MXM component by Apex, it talks natively to Ecotech and aqua elimination products, which primarily use Mobius for configuration. But now you can do it in Apex Fusion. So if I run my app, I'm actually using the what they call beta UI. I think everybody's now using this, everybody's accustomed to it. You can see I have 3 systems, and just if you want to know what my systems are, you can look at the previous video. But I do have my Lagoon system, which is a 5-foot water box. It's fully LPS dominant system. Then there is the Treasure Reef. This is the aquarium that is behind me. Now, it's a little bit murky right now. That's because I've been working on it all morning, just aquascaping, and there's another video coming. Again, compared to what it was like in the previous video, it's quite different. And finally, there's a quarantine system, and I did a whole video on my coral quarantine, and I think that it's super important. But as I said before, all of my aquariums are configured very similarly. I like that because spatially I want things to be in the same places. I want to mostly call the same thing, so I don't waste any of my energy in context switching. So if I'm running between multiple aquariums, I just want to see things, and I also rely heavily on reminders, alerts or alarms. So this way, if something is out of whack, even if I'm not there to see it, I want to be notified. So super important, and I would say probably 70% of what I do with my Apex in my situation is monitoring. It's super important to me. Having said that, now there's so much controlling that's no longer done by Apex directly, such as the programmable aqua elimination and Ecotech systems. So you can do that, or you can also do them in Apex, which is what I've done recently with the MXM, and I absolutely love it. So let's take a look at my biggest system, the Treasure Reef. Now, don't be fooled. This is not just one system. You can see just what you see here is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. And it actually is connected to my whole farm. And if I click on my treasure reef, and over here you can actually see a photo of the farm, and this allows me to easily identify which controller I'm working with, or which controller instance. Now, before we go there, let's take a look at kind of the main Beta UI screen. And you can see all of my parameters here. My temperature, pH, salinity, alkalinity, calcium is a little bit too high, and my magnesium, but they are roughly ranges that I like them to be at. And you can also see that you've got this level thing. So this actually does look like my little sump chamber in my last chamber in my sump, and it's at around 6.4 inches. I've calibrated it recently, and honestly, this is probably one of my absolute favorite new features of Apex. I'm definitely going to be setting it up on my Lagoon system as well. So super useful, and this allows me to make sure that, let's say if my auto top off stops working, my pumps don't run dry. So I absolutely love it. Now, let's actually go in, and as I said earlier, all of my aquariums are being set up the same way. I want to see the photo of aquarium first. This is super important because I can at a glance see what I'm dealing with here. And a little tidbit, this photo is actually a live photo. I get it from Aquatic Log, aquaticlog.com. If you go in there and you have an account there, if you go to photos, you can actually click on the live photo and copy paste that link into your Apex, which you can see right here under aquarium photo. And the cool thing about it is that as you upload or make new key photos in Aquatic Log, it will automatically get reflected in your Apex, which I think is pretty cool. Now, moving down, the next most important thing to me is my feed cycles. I rely on those buttons immensely. So A, B, C, D. These are things that I program a little bit differently in different aquariums, just because for some of them there's more functionality, for some less. And in this particular case, usually it kind of goes from the lightest or minimal impact to maximum impact or consequences. To give you an example, A would be, let's say, a feeding, whether it's a fish feeding or coral feeding. Then B and C would be something in between, and then D is, let's say, me doing maintenance. I want to shut things off and no longer actually be able to worry about, let's say, pumps running dry or other things of this nature. So D just usually shuts everything off. That's my thing. And you can configure the times. Again, it's quite different. So feeding maybe 20 minutes or an hour, depending on whether you're feeding fish or coral. And usually my D is around an hour as well, because this is the time when I'm working on the tank. Now, if we move down, Trident is probably, my next best discovered feature. Like, I absolutely love it. I did a whole video about it in the past, and I still run it regularly. Now, for this video, you can see that I'm getting a little warning. That means that my other reagents are getting close to empty. So I'm just waiting for my alkalinity to be exhausted, and then I'll replace all three of them at once. You can actually set up a little alarm that will let you know this. And I've done it before, but right now, just because you cannot differentiate in the alarm message or alarm rule to only get it for alkalinity, you'll always get that message. And I currently want to exhaust my alkalinity. But you can see that my alk, calcium and magnesium is right up in front. It measures this either 4 times per day when it comes to alkalinity, and calcium, magnesium twice per day. Super important. And I do have rules that will tell me if my alkalinity is lower than say 7.5 or higher than 9. I want to be notified with the alarm. So I've configured this particular rule here. I've done the same rules for, let's say, salt. So if I click on my salt, which is 36.1, I will I always use the advanced tab here. You can see that I'll get notified by an alarm if my salt goes below 33.5 or above 36.5. This is kind of where I like it. And I try to keep those the same between all of my systems. Again, less kind of context switching here. Same goes for pH. I usually want to be notified for pH lower than 7.7 or above 8.6. I don't think I've ever reached my 8.6, and there's a whole other thing we can talk about on keeping pH high. Temperature, I usually try to be around 77, so if it goes above 79 or below 75, I want to be notified. Or P, I've only recently been playing with, and I guess the school of thought is if your snail dies or fish, you will see the change in your ORP, and then you can just kind of look around and see what's going on with the tank. Finally, there's level, and this level thing, like I said, is something that I don't think I'll ever run an aquarium without it. One of the reasons is I use automatic water changes on both of my large systems, and well, technically even the quarantine is automatic water change, so I don't do any water changes by hand. And when you do water changes, I currently use the Versa by Ecotech pumps, which is great, but if you don't calibrate it for probably 3-4 months, sometimes it will start to drift, and this will allow me to with the salinity to see if I'm drifting it one way, or if, let's say, I'm overdoing it with adding salt water, or let's say if I'm running kalkwasser, which I do, then I will also know if I'm adding too much. So my level in the last chamber will rise up, will let me know with a warning. So right now I'm monitoring primarily if the level goes down, but you can actually specify the up as well. The reason I have not set up the upper range for this is because I turn off my aquariums all the time for different reasons, and my water level would rise up whenever I turn off one of my systems. It's pretty easy to do it on like a single aquarium, but with my aquarium that has multiple systems, I have not yet figured out the best way to program it, but maybe that's something down the line. Now, moving down, you have my power bar, voltage, amps, and watts. I don't really pay too much attention to those, nor I have any special rules. However, I like the idea of having rules that, for example, will turn off your skimmer if your pump is off. Right now I rely on the level or the digital switch, but you can also do it this way. So pretty cool. And even if your pump, let's say, dies and your outlet is on but the pump is off, you can program it so that if there's no amperage for that particular outlet, the skimmer won't be running. So those are pretty cool things in my opinion. The next one is my feeder. So right now I've called it acro feeder because it was primarily on my acro system, and I've turned it off just because I need to add more fish food in there. But right now I've been running it once per day, and it's tied to also my A button, but I can configure it to be running as many times as I want. So this is something that I'm still playing with. I feed my fish a lot of frozen food as well as manually, so I have not really been relying on it for more than once a day yet, but that's coming. Now, going back, you have a few switches. So these switches I haven't used yet, but the next section is my actual outlets on the bar. And while I don't use all of them, one thing that I always try to do, again mentally, is organize them, because there's 8 outlets, so it always goes in the order of the outlets: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I know that the 4th and 8th one are usually the lighter outlets, the ones that switch non-mechanically, if I recall correctly. So I usually try to put something lighter on them. So for example, my dozer would go there, but let's say the pump would go on one of the regular outlets. And with that, there's always, let's say, a pump, power heads, and usually I don't do too much to these things, just because they are, the pump is usually being run at exactly the same speed. But you may notice that now I have this feed B, feed D thing, so they will be turning off those outlets when I'm feeding. When it comes to outlets, I try not to go too extensively in programming them. I used to before, but I find that now, because there's so many smart things, your pumps are not the same as they used to be, and same for the lights. It used to be that the light was all pretty dumb and didn't have much controllability in it, or no way to connect it to Wi-Fi, and that's why you needed these outlets to orchestrate all these different modes of turning on, let's say, different banks of lights. And nowadays you don't really need this. You program the lights separately, and then the outlets are pretty straightforward. So usually when it comes to programming, there's not a lot when it comes to that. However, you may see that, for example, if I look at my Skimmer, for Skimmer, there's a few extra rules. I have a switch, so it's called S-float, and if it's closed, so that means that the water level has come up too high and my skimmer may get overflown, then I want my skimmer to be off. And you may also notice that I have this wait 5 minutes after I've been off to be back on, so that just gives the time for the whole system to settle, let's say if I'm restarting things, and again it doesn't overflow. So I really like this, and it's been working great for me so far. Now when it comes to other functions, obviously there's things like heaters, and so for the heaters it's the same idea. I want to configure things, so if I run things at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, anything below 76.5, I don't want the heater to be on. Anything above 77.5, I want it to be on, off and on, vice versa. Now, there is things like hysteresis that I could play with, but since I have 3 heaters, I usually don't do it because it kind of balances everything out. Now, going further, you may notice that I have this one last item, which is saltwater switch, and I've put this optical sensor in my saltwater container, which is used for my automatic water change. So when the water goes all the way down and becomes empty, this is time for me to refill my container. And what I'm going to be doing next is, unfortunately I cannot right now program MXM for the dozers. Hopefully one day I will be able to, because then it will be pretty easy to just say, hey, if the water container is off, don't do it. But what I can do is just turn off the 2 pumps that are doing the automatic water change dosing, and this is a pretty easy rule to specify here. I also have a few alarms and warnings. So my thought process there is, I want the warning, which is just a little beep sound every minute, like a little beep, to tell me when I should just pay attention to something. So for example, if we go in there, I've configured it so that if my alkalinity starts to go a little bit higher than 8.5 or below 7, before I get my email, I want to maybe get notified next time I'm working on the tank, and I'll check, and maybe I'll course correct before I start getting the emails when I'm at work, for example. So that was always my thought process, so something less intrusive than an email. And also I do like my alarm, because for the alarms I want an actual like, more bugging sound. So I want something that draws attention. It's a little bit louder. So if there is water there, I want to know about it right away. I not only want to get messages on my phone, but because I could get my do not disturb on it, I want somebody to hear it, or it's me hearing it and getting all of my attention into what's going on with my something being wet. This is pretty serious, and it saved me quite a few times, more times than I want to admit. Finally, let's talk about my MXM. So I did the whole video on MXM before, and I've been using it for the past few months, and I absolutely love it. For me, this is pretty cool. I've configured it for all of my MP40s, and if I click on one of the MP40s, you can see that guess what? I'm not using Mobius to configure an MP40. I'm actually using my Apex Fusion for that. And I kind of like this interface as well. It's quite different. So again, you have to think in slightly different terms when it comes to that. And I'm not sure I like that whole chart representation of this, because to me, when I look at this chart, from the point at 0 hours to 9 a.m., it sounds like, the reef crest is dropping all the way to 5%, but in reality, it's actually running flat for all this time. So I think that the chart doesn't quite show what's really happening. At least this is how I understand. But I do like the fact that I can move things around very easily, and it gets reflected right away. So you get some points from that perspective. But what I really love is the fact that I can, let's see if I click on the settings here and go to advanced, I have this thing, if feed B, then off. I could not do that before. I could do it with turning off the outlet, but I don't want to turn off the outlet. I want to actually talk to the MP40 in question, and now I can. So that is my third, probably most exciting feature that came around, that I've discovered in 2023. So I'll show you an example. So say I want to work on my coral farm, and for me to turn everything off, what I could do before is either press a button on my Apex and then it would turn off the outlets. But a lot of times I want to maybe bring them down to 5%, or let's say I move things around and I don't know what my outlets are, or play around with Vectra. So there's all these things where just turning off and cycling something is not the right approach. I want the pumps to be still on, just not running. So now I can do it, and I find this is super easy to do now, because before, even if I would run Mobius, now I have to go and do the scene, and sometimes maybe I would still do it, but here I can just do it with a single tap, and it's pretty much instant, which is what I want. When I'm working on my aquariums, I don't want to wait even 5 seconds for a certain operation. I just want to be able to press one button and for things to happen. So this is, for me, a killer feature for MXM, and I've been using this now and really like it. I think we've covered all of my configurations for my most advanced system. This is my reef. My lagoon system is a little bit simpler, but very similar. And my quarantine system is dead simple. It actually controls 2 aquariums, my coral quarantine and then the fish tank. And it's the simplest of them all. But to sum up, I think that even in 2023, dedicated controllers are super important. I've had my experience running multiple other brands, and I must say that Apex, for some reason, really speaks to me. I find that I like that idea. You can see that it's designed by programmers, somebody that really cares about the little details of programming. It may be a little bit intimidating at first. When I got my first controller 12 years ago, I never had any issues with it, but a lot of my friends were a little bit intimidated by maybe some of the programming aspects. So you have to really kind of think in this way, especially when it comes to programming timers and whatnot. But what you can see now, we're in a completely different world. In 2023, I find that one of the really cool things that Apex has is this list of tasks. So you don't need to do a lot of programming, just you want to calibrate something, or you want to change reagents or hook something up, you go to tasks, you click on that, and then a lot of times there will even be a video guiding you through the process. So I rely on this extensively whenever I'm doing any type of calibration, and I find it's a lot easier now. So overall, it's something that I use regularly, and also it's nice to see that they still invest in their software. So it's an ecosystem that I'm comfortable with. So that wraps up today's video. Let me know what you think, how I can maybe configure things to be even better. I know there's lots of really advanced things there with virtual outlets and more intense programming, but I haven't spent too much time thinking about all those cases, but especially there's some low-hanging fruit things that I can, or you run, that you think you can share. Please let me know, and in the coming videos I'll make sure to mention them as well. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.